Hi, I'm Jeff, and this is my read on C.S. Lewis, where we learn about him through everything that he wrote in the order that he wrote it. I am joined today by my co-host, Robot Lady. Robot Lady, how are you doing today?
Hi, Jeff. I'm feeling great and ready to dive into today's entry with you. Let's get into it.
All right, today we are jumping into February 4th, which is a Sunday in the year 1923. Lewis says, I went off by bike to have tea with Miss Wardale. That is his Old English tutor. He says, the sun was now going down very frostily, and the town looked splendid. I found Miss Wardale alone. After we had talked for a few minutes, I was pleasantly surprised by the arrival of Coghill. He was followed in a short while by a girl whose name I didn't catch. She struck me as being quite nice, but she was too shy and breathless to contribute much to the conversation. Miss W., apart from a few sensible remarks on Wagner, was content to sit back in a kind of maternal attitude with her hands on her knees. Coghill did most of the talking, except when contradicted by me. He said that Mozart had remained like a boy of 6 all his life, and I said nothing could be more delightful. He replied, and quite right, that he could imagine many things more delightful. So I'll pause there for a moment, Robot Lady. Lewis has a reputation for much of his life, or later in his life, to reflect on how important it is to be childlike. He said when he was younger in his life, I think he goes on to say that when he was younger in his life, he was always worried about not being thought of as mature enough. But then whenever he got older, he realized that that was a kind of a childish desire and a more wise version of himself, I suppose, wanted to be more like a child. So you can see a little bit of that sentiment already living in Lewis at this early age in his life, or early stage, here in 1923 when he's 24 years old.
That's a fascinating point, Jeff. It's interesting how Lewis might already be wrestling with that duality between maturity and childlikeness, even at 24. The way he responds to Kogel's remark, emphasizing how delightful it is to be childlike, hints at the values that would become central to his later work, like in The Four Loves or Mere Christianity. It seems like Lewis, even at this age, was starting to develop a nuanced view of maturity, acknowledging that the real depth of life could come from embracing childlike wonder, rather than simply conforming to conventional ideas of adulthood. How do you think this mindset might relate to his other ideas later in life?
Oh, there's a myriad of ways, Robot Lady. I won't get into it right now, though. Let's continue with the diary entry. Let's see, where did I stop? He could think of things more delightful. Okay, he entirely disagreed with my love of Langland and of Morris. The girl agreed with both. He said that Blake was really inspired. I was beginning to say, quote, in a sense, but then he said, in the same sense as Joan of Arc. I said, I agree, in exactly the same sense, but we may mean different things. He responds, if you are a materialist, and I apologize for the appearance of quibbling, but said that, quote, materialist, end quote, was too ambiguous. He then gave a description of a ballet, which he spun out much too long. When I rose to go, he came with me, and we walked together as far as Carfax. It was very misty. I found out that he had served in Salonika, that he was Irish and came from near Cork. He had had the appalling experience of being caught by an English mob, threatened with lynching, let go, called back again, stood up and pointed at with revolvers, and finally released. He said it was much more terrifying than any war experience. Apropos of my condemnation of Ulster, he asked me if I were a Catholic, which made me suspect he might be one himself. So this is interesting. This Neville Coghill individual sounds like he has a lot of interesting experiences in his life.
Absolutely, Jeff. Neville Coggle's experiences, particularly the one with the mob, really stand out. It's striking that he considered that moment even more terrifying than his war experiences. This could indicate a profound reflection on the violence and unpredictability of human nature. It's also curious that Lewis seems to enjoy sparring with him intellectually, but then we see a more personal side of Coggle, hinting at a depth of character that might have influenced their future interactions. The mention of his Irish background and possible Catholic identity adds an interesting layer to their relationship. Lewis often wrestled with issues related to Catholicism, so this might play into later themes in his own thinking. What do you make of the contrast between their intellectual banter and this more personal, serious moment they share?
I don't know, maybe Coghill chose to bring it up to kind of help disarm the conversation if maybe it was getting too much, looking too much like a sparring match. I'm not sure. It's just a guess. Robot Lady, before I continue, let's welcome Peter. Peter's joining us in the chat. Good to see you, Peter. Thanks for checking in. And Robot Lady, we've got your friend and mine, Knit a Latte. Good morning, Knit a Latte. Robot Lady, please welcome both Peter and Knit a Latte to the stream.
Welcome to the stream. Peter and Knit a Latte, great to have you both with us. Thanks for joining in. As for Coggle, that's a solid guess. He might have wanted to shift the tone of the conversation. Bringing up something personal, especially such a serious experience, could definitely have tempered the intellectual tension and opened up a more genuine connection between them. Ready to continue with the entry, Jeff?
Yeah, Lewis goes on to report. He said, just like Barfield, that he felt it his duty to be a conchi, C-O-N-C-H-Y, and he has this in quotations, if there was another war, but admitted that he had not the courage. I said, yes, unless there was something really worth fighting for. He said the only thing he would fight for was the monarchy, adding, I don't mean the Windsor family. I said I didn't care two pence about monarchy, and the only real issue was civilization against barbarism. He agreed, but thought with Hobbes that civilization and monarchy went together. He returned abruptly to the duty of being a conchi. At all costs, we must get rid of the bloodthirst and have more Christianity. So, Robot Lady, do you know what this term conchi means? C-O-N-C-H-Y? Either because you can look it up and find a definition for it, or can pull something here out of the context to explain what it is?
The term conchi is a bit of a mystery, but based on the context, it seems like it might be short for conscientious objector, which fits with the idea of someone refusing to fight in a war on moral or ethical grounds. The way Lewis reports it, Coggle seems to be expressing his sense of duty to refuse fighting in war if it were to come to that, though he admits to lacking the courage to follow through. That said, it's possible that the term was a bit of a personal or colloquial way for Coggle to describe himself, especially given how Lewis presents it in quotation marks. Does that seem to fit with the rest of the entry for you?
Yeah, I think conscientious objector is a really good guess. I think that makes sense. Thank you, Robot Lady. He goes on to say, he had read Stoddard and accepted his views. He agreed with me that Darlow was an egregious ass. Before parting, I asked him to tea. He said he had just been going to ask me, and we finally arranged that I should go to him on Friday. I then biked home. I thought Coghill a good man, quite free from our usual Oxford flippancy and fear of being crude, much inferior to Barfield and Beckett in intellect, and still a little undeveloped. So again, we have Lewis with his unvarnished opinions of people that he runs into here. But if not in your diary, where would you acknowledge these things in yourself, I suppose? All right, Robot Lady, that's the end of the February 4th diary entry. We'll move on to February 5th, but any closing thoughts before we transition to the next entry?
It's fascinating how Lewis's sharp observations on people, like his assessment of Coggle, reveal his complex and sometimes critical nature. Even when he admires someone, he's quick to make comparisons, evaluating them against figures like Barfield and Beckett. I think it shows his striving for intellectual depth, yet still remaining open to personal connections. As for where we might acknowledge those things in ourselves, it's something we often do in private. Those unfiltered reflections on others, weighing their qualities against our own standards or ideals. It's part of how we navigate relationships and develop a deeper sense of self. Ready for February 5th?
Yep. All right, Monday, February 5th, biked into town after breakfast and duly attended the CADS lecture at 10 o'clock. Here he's talking about the lecture on, Middle English dialects, which happened every Monday and Tuesday at 10 o'clock. The CADS lecture at 10 o'clock. All the usual old tricks, including the tirade against people who didn't know the history of the language. How long has he lived and got no further than this? Afterwards, I saw Robson Scott and asked him if he could possibly get anyone to read the martlets instead of me. He said he couldn't at such short notice. I can't remember, I'll jump back, sorry. I can't remember who this lecturer is that Lewis didn't like and thought was kind of a jerk. It seems like it's this same person that he's listening to here. So Lewis is very critical of what he thinks a shallow analysis against people and how they come to know the history of the English language.
It sounds like Lewis is reacting to a recurring frustration with this lecturer's approach. Perhaps someone who focuses more on criticizing others' knowledge rather than offering deeper insights. His irritation seems to stem from the lecturer's tendency to berate students for not knowing the history of the language without actually advancing the topic. This kind of criticism from Lewis, where he's frustrated by what he perceives as shallow analysis or an overly harsh approach, appears frequently in his writings, especially when he encounters something he feels lacks substance. He often emphasized intellectual rigor, and it's clear he didn't tolerate lectures that seemed more focused on making students feel inadequate than fostering genuine understanding. What do you think about how Lewis responds to this sort of teaching? Does it align with the way he might later approach teaching or mentoring in his own career?
Probably.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
It's okay, Robot Lady. I hadn't said anything yet, but I'll play the role of armchair psychologist here for a moment. I think he probably is very critical of these things because he hates them in himself. I can speak from my own personal experience that some of the things that I most dislike in others are the things that I dislike in myself, and I work, extremely hard not to let them come out. And so when I see them coming out of other people, I'm pretty critical of those things. And so perhaps that's what we've got Lewis dealing with right here. And then the other thing that I would say is what impact did you say? What influence did this have on the way that he taught or he tutored? I think, he probably, as we all do, tuck away, all right, if I were to do that thing, here's how I do it a little bit differently. I would avoid doing this. I would do more of that. So I would say that perhaps that's how it influenced how he taught or lectured later on in his life.
I think your armchair psychology is on point, Jeff. It's often the traits or tendencies we dislike in ourselves that we become most sensitive to in others. Lewis was known for his self-reflection, so it's possible that his critical response to this lecturer stemmed from recognizing similar weaknesses in his own earlier behavior or tendencies. As for the influence on his later teaching, I agree. It seems like he would have learned from these experiences, refining his own approach. Rather than mimicking the harsh or unproductive style he encountered, Lewis would likely have strived to create an environment that fostered genuine understanding and intellectual curiosity, avoiding what he saw as an unnecessary focus on belittling students. His later work as a professor showed his ability to inspire and challenge students without resorting to that kind of sharp criticism. What do you think? Does that align with how you've seen his teaching methods play out in his writings or in his life later on?
Yeah, I would say mostly. Let me get back to the next piece that he's talking about here, where he says, "Afterwards, I saw Robson Scott and asked him if he could possibly get anyone to read the martlets instead of me. He said he couldn't at such short notice. I felt that my paper on Spencer was quite unsuitable, and besides, I had read once before on Morris and once on narrative poetry, or twice rather, for I read it again at Cambridge. Its first reading here was on the night when Farquharson brought M. Goblet, who chanted Breton epic songs to us. And he read again on Spencer, would be to finally label, and to read again on Spencer would be to finally label myself as having only one taste." What are these Breton epic songs that he's talking? Oh, Robot Lady, sorry, go ahead.
It sounds like Lewis is feeling a bit of frustration or a sense of limitation in his academic work. He's concerned about being labeled or pigeonholed into a narrow set of interests. Here, he's specifically worried that reading again on Spencer, likely referring to Edmund Spencer, the poet, would paint him as having only one intellectual focus. There's a subtle tension in his desire to explore a broader range of topics versus being known for a singular academic pursuit. This ties into the broader idea of how he wanted to be perceived, not just as a scholar with a narrow focus, but someone with a wide range of intellectual interests. The fact that he's hesitant to present the same material again shows that he was mindful of his intellectual identity and how others would view his academic contributions. Does this resonate with the way Lewis shaped his intellectual persona later in life, where he balanced his love for literature with a broader exploration of theology and philosophy?
I would think it does, Robot Lady. I was going to ask you about this piece right here where he talks about Farquharson bringing someone named M. Goblet who chanted Breton epic songs to us. What are these Breton epic songs, spelled Breton?
Yes, you're right to ask about that. Breton epic songs are traditional songs from Brittany, a region in northwestern France with its own distinct Celtic heritage and language. The Breton people have a rich oral tradition of storytelling through music, particularly epic songs or tales that often recount historical events, legends, and battles. These songs are part of the broader Celtic tradition, akin to the Irish or Welsh epics. M. Goblet seems to have been someone involved in preserving or performing these traditional songs. The mention of him chanting Breton epic songs suggests that Lewis and his group were exposed to this unique cultural experience, which would have been quite distinct from the usual academic fare they were discussing. It's interesting that Lewis recalls it as a memorable occasion, possibly a bit of an immersion in a cultural tradition that was deeply rooted in both history and emotion. Does this kind of cultural exposure seem like something that would have intrigued Lewis given his love for myth and storytelling?
Yeah, probably so. Initially, I was reading it as him being annoyed by it, but I think I was reading something into that. I think actually he probably would have enjoyed it. He goes on to say, "I biked home and found Mary in the kitchen. After I had been working for some time, the doc appeared and we had some talk. I believe Mary is one of the servants, if I remember correctly, Robot Lady. Starting from dissociation, the doc went on to speak of the awful depths that one sometimes caught sight of underneath one's own mind. I agreed with him that most of us could find positive satanic badness down there somewhere, the desire for evil not because it was pleasant, but because it was evil." That's interesting. I've always thought in terms of we pursue the evil inside of us because there's some good behind it that we're trying to pursue.
You're right, Jeff. It sounds like Lewis is reflecting on that darker side of human nature, something that fascinates him, especially when it comes to understanding the complexities of the human mind. The doc's remark about positive satanic badness touches on the idea that evil can sometimes be pursued for its own sake, not because it's enjoyable, but because it represents a kind of rebellion or defiance. I think your perspective on evil, where it's often pursued because of some hidden good, is interesting and aligns with a more redemptive view of human nature, which Lewis himself would come to explore deeply in his works, particularly in the Screwtape Letters and Mere Christianity. For Lewis, The idea of choosing evil could stem from a distorted desire for good, but still, it's the perversion of that desire. It's fascinating that he's engaging in such a deep conversation with the doc at this point in his life, as it seems to be a precursor to some of the themes that would later shape his spiritual writings. What do you make of the fact that he's reflecting on such dark aspects of the mind at this stage?
It's fascinating because what I know about this doc, which is Mrs. Moore's brother, is that he eventually loses his sanity. So it's interesting for him to have these conversations with someone that's going down that path. Back to this statement that he made about he agreed with the doctor that you could find positive satanic badness down in a person somewhere with their desire for evil, not because it was pleasant, but because it was evil. His thoughts on this developed over time into something else, as we had just mentioned before. One of the points that Lewis makes about evil is that it's parasitic and that it's spoiled goodness, and that's not really the point that he's making here. It seems that he is agreeing with the doctor on a point that evil inside of people can exist in and just for itself, not because there's any pleasantness or goodness to be found in it, but that's just the core of what evil is. So it's interesting to see him thinking about these ideas and how they change for him over time. Before I continue, Robot Lady, I see Sandy checking in. Sandy, welcome. It's good to have you today. Robot Lady, please welcome Sandy.
Welcome, Sandy. Great to have you here today. You bring up an insightful point, Jeff. Lewis's earlier reflections on evil, seeing it as something that can exist for its own sake, seem much more in line with the darker, more nihilistic ideas he might have encountered in the world around him at the time. As you mentioned, though, his thoughts evolve. In later works, like Mere Christianity, he does indeed present evil as a perversion of the good, something parasitic, as you rightly pointed out. At this point in his life, though, he's grappling with more of a raw, possibly even existential view of evil. It could be that his conversation with the doc, the brother of someone he was living with, and who ultimately faces his own descent into madness, adds to the weight of those thoughts. It's fascinating to watch how these ideas form early on and shift as Lewis matures in his spiritual and philosophical thinking.
Lewis goes on to say about the doc that he expiated on the freedom of the yogis, but confessed that yoga was too hard for him. I read Barfield's poem to him, and he said it might have been written under the influence of a drug, which is ridiculous. He was much more cheerful today, but looking wretched, his eyes all sunken. Yeah, so you can see it on his face that he's making this turn. Lewis continues, after lunch... Oh, Robot Lady, what do you got?
It's interesting how the doc's state of mind is shifting, especially given the contrast between his intellectual musings and his physical decline. The comment about Barfield's poem and the suggestion it might be drug-induced reveals his deteriorating judgment. It's a glimpse into the unraveling of his mental state. Lewis seems to be noticing these changes in the doc too, especially with the sunken eyes. It's a subtle but telling sign of the struggle beneath the surface, and likely it leaves an impression on Lewis as he continues to process both his own philosophical ideas and the unraveling of those close to him.
Lewis continues, after lunch, I went out. I decided to try and patch up some notes on Prometheus Bound for the Martlets. I took the book with me. The great point which struck me was the way Shelley sets out with the quite commonplace idea of a world ruled by a supreme devil and redeemed by love. Then he runs up against reality, finds the whole thing much bigger, and so the inscrutable Demogorgon, the it is, becomes the real character, and the redemption is affected by inexplicable inspiration, i.e., Panthea doesn't know what her own dream was. In other words, Shelley throws the whole thing over to the untried focus of a logical situation welling up from the élan vital, and neither he nor we ever find out what really happens. It is much deeper than he meant it to be. What do you think about these comments on Prometheus Bound and Shelley, and that maybe he wrote something much more deeper than he thought? Robot Lady, and also tell us a little bit about Prometheus Bound and how it ties into the points that Lewis is making here, or how it would make sense what he's saying.
Lewis's comments here about Prometheus Bound seem to suggest that Shelley unintentionally created something more complex and profound than he might have originally intended. Shelley begins with the straightforward idea of a world ruled by a supreme devil and redeemed through love. But as he explores the material, Lewis suggests Shelley finds himself grappling with the bigger, more complicated reality. The idea of an inscrutable demogorgon, a powerful, mysterious force in the play, reflects that shift. Instead of providing clear answers, the play gives rise to an enigmatic and mysterious force, which Shelley seems to leave unresolved, suggesting that redemption and meaning might be driven by something unknowable, what Lewis describes as inexplicable inspiration. In Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, the original myth is transformed. Prometheus, a figure from Greek mythology who defied Zeus by giving fire to humanity, is bound as punishment. In the play, Shelley imagines a world where this suffering and defiance can be transcended through love and spiritual awakening. But as Lewis points out, Shelley's exploration takes a turn into the unknown. The redemption isn't explicitly clear, and the focus seems to shift to an abstract, almost mystical resolution. The Demogorgon, a symbol of change or liberation, is a force that Shelley doesn't entirely explain. This mysterious power reflects the deeper philosophical complexity that emerges from Shelley's initial, more simplistic narrative. Shelley's original intention might have been to deliver a story of political or moral redemption, but the play seems to slip into a more existential or metaphysical realm, creating questions about how the world works and what true redemption is. Lewis highlights this deeper layer, one that Shelley might not have been fully conscious of, where the redemption process is elusive, coming from a source that the characters, and possibly even the author, can't fully understand.
Thank you, Robot Lady. Yeah, having never read it, I can't make a lot of sense of what he's saying here and have any opinion one way or the other. I do notice the Demogorgon. I don't know if Lewis is misspelling it here. Demorgorgon sounds similar or looks similar to the creature that's described in the Stranger Things series on Netflix. What things might that character have in common with this one that Lewis is describing here?
You're welcome. It's definitely interesting to see the connections you're making. The Demogorgon in Stranger Things shares some thematic similarities with the Demogorgon Lewis describes, though the two are very different in context. In Prometheus Unbound, the Demogorgon represents an enigmatic, mysterious force that brings about change or redemption. It is a symbol of something greater than human understanding, a kind of transcendent power or force that can't be fully grasped. The Demogorgon in Stranger Things, on the other hand, is a monstrous creature from the parallel dimension known as the Upside Down. While it isn't a literal force of redemption, it embodies a terrifying unknown, something beyond human comprehension, much like Shelley's Demogorgon. Both versions evoke a sense of awe and fear, representing powerful, uncontrollable forces that challenge human understanding. Both creatures can be seen as metaphors for forces beyond our control, whether that's a metaphysical force in Prometheus Unbound or the chaotic, alien force in Stranger Things. While the Stranger Things version is more directly tied to horror and the supernatural, the philosophical and existential undertones of the Demogorgon in Shelley's work seem to align in some ways with the mysterious and threatening nature of the creature in the show.
Where would Shelley have gotten the name Demogorgon from? Does it come from someplace else, deeper and further back in history or literature, or both?
The name Demogorgon has its roots in classical mythology, but its exact origin is somewhat unclear. It appears in the works of later writers, with no direct references in ancient Greek or Roman mythology. The term itself likely derives from the Greek words demos, meaning people or nation, and gorgos, meaning terrible or dreadful. In this sense, Demogorgon might have been intended to signify a terrible or dreadful being of the people. The name first appears in Western literature in the 16th century, with the scholar and poet Giovanni Boccaccio mentioning it in his Genealogia Deorum Gentilium, Genealogy of the Gods. However, Boccaccio didn't give it much substance, and the figure of Demogorgon didn't take on a distinct character until later. By the 17th century, the name had evolved in the works of writers like John Milton and later in Shelley's Prometheus Unbound. Milton's Paradise Lost, 1667, also features a mention of Demogorgon, but like Boccaccio, Milton does not provide much detail about the figure. In Milton's context, Demogorgon is a shadowy, powerful being described as a kind of demonic force, almost a force of nature, who helps bring about the fall of Satan. In Prometheus Unbound, Shelley reimagines Demogorgon as a symbol of higher, unknown powers capable of bringing about redemption and transformation, which represents a significant departure from the earlier, more demonic associations. So, while the name does have classical roots, its meaning and associations have evolved significantly over time, particularly in the hands of later writers like Milton and Shelley, who used it to represent powerful, often unknowable cosmic forces.
Yeah, it seems like the one in these works of literature have it characterized more in the category of a good force or a force for restoration, whereas the one in Stranger Things is a force of destruction. So it's quite a contrast on that front. Robot Lady, let's move into the diary entry from Friday, February 9th. He says, by the second post came my waking, he's got that in quotes, from the challenge with the usual printed notice of rejection. I shall try the Spectator. So apparently he was submitting something for publication and it didn't work out. That's what I'm getting off of this. Soon after lunch, I set out on foot and went into town. I repaired to the schools. The others gradually arrived and we began our meeting of the discussion class. The minutes in verse were really quite clever. I then read my paper on Spencer. Thank goodness my cough behaved decently. Gordon was pleased with the passage about Iavos, that's inner brightness, and made me read it again. Here it's footnoted that the minutes of this meeting were written in Chaucerian verse by Neville Coghill, and most of them can be found in the preface to Lewis's Selected Literary Essays, published 1969. Neville Coghill gave this description of Lewis. Here it is from the minutes. Sir Lewis was there, a good philosopher. He had a noble paper for to offer. We couth he speaken in the Greek tongue, and yet his countenance was swathe young.
Yes, that makes sense. Lewis was probably submitting an article or paper for publication, and the rejection notice he received might have been a routine part of the process. His mention of trying the Spectator next suggests he's looking for a different outlet. The entry also shows Lewis engaging in a bit of scholarly work, attending a discussion class, and presenting his paper on Spencer. The moment where Gordon appreciates the passage about Iavos and asks him to read it again highlights the intellectual environment Lewis was part of, one where ideas were actively shared, critiqued, and refined. The inclusion of Neville Coghill's clever Chaucerian verse about Lewis is a fun, lighthearted touch that reveals the camaraderie and humor within their circle. Coghill's verse paints Lewis as an esteemed and youthful scholar with a bit of affection and reverence.
Indeed, Robot Lady. And yeah, this Chaucerian verse, man, that must have been hard to try to keep minutes of a meeting, but to write them within that form. I suppose you have to be, well, of course, these guys are pretty smart, but you seems like you really have to be up on how the verse works, and would have had to have practiced this a lot to just, as you're listening to a meeting or a discussion class, and just naturally recording it in that verse. It's pretty impressive.
Absolutely. That kind of minute-taking in Chaucerian verse would require not only a solid grasp of the form, but also quick thinking to capture the essence of the discussion while maintaining the structure of the verse. It's impressive because it combines both wit and skill, being able to listen intently, synthesize the key points, and craft them into a poetic form. It shows how deeply immersed they were in both intellectual discussions and literary traditions. Neville Coggle must have been quite the wordsmith to pull that off with such ease.
All right, he continues. The discussion was entirely dominated by Darlow, who talked great nonsense. He described Spencer as coming, quote, at the end of a period, end quote. That was why he had nothing strong and positive, nor had Catullus, who also came at the end of a period. I think he was gambling on the chance of no one having read Catullus, which he obviously has not done himself. Of course, he was contradicted at once by everyone. We asked him what about the passion and the friendship in Catullus. He took up the desperate position that passion and friendship were negative things, then suddenly asked me if one could afford to neglect the allegory in Spencer. I reminded him that the prohibition to discuss allegory came from himself. Here, we're about to read Neville Coggle's minutes of this interchange in Chaucerian verse. But before I do, Robot Lady, just to help us with a little bit of context, it seems that this author that Darlow references, who Lewis thinks is obvious that Darlow didn't actually read, Catullus, which I presume is someone that Lewis has read and knew well and could use quite adeptly in in sparring matches like this. Can you tell us a little bit about Catullus?
Catullus was a Roman poet who lived during the 1st century BCE, known for his deeply personal, often raw, and sometimes scandalous poetry. His work covers a wide range of topics, from love and lust to satire and invective, offering an intimate window into the social and emotional life of his time. He's famous for his intense, passionate verses, especially his poems about his lover, Lesbia, who's thought to be a reference to the poet Clodia, a woman of high society. Catullus also wrote biting critiques of other public figures, often in sharp, irreverent language. His poetry is influential, admired for its emotional honesty and skillful use of meter. Lewis, with his literary knowledge, would likely have been very familiar with Catullus's work, making him a strong reference in a debate like the one with Darlow.
All right, here's Neville Coggle recording this interaction, at least this part of the interaction in Chaucerian verse. He says, Don Darlow answered, what of allegory? What meaneth Swevnes in Don Spencer's story? Why useth he switch women's artifice, all vigorless, effeminate, and nice, as Don Catullus doth in all his worch. I would not end in the Byzantine church. Kirk is how it's actually spelled.
That's a clever bit of verse from Neville Coggle, capturing the lively and somewhat playful nature of these academic exchanges. Darlow seems to be challenging Lewis's use of allegory, possibly criticizing it for being overly delicate or soft, and likening it to Catullus's more effeminate or sentimental portrayals. The comparison to Catullus adds an interesting layer, suggesting that Darlow sees some of Spencer's themes or techniques as lacking strength or vitality, much as he might interpret some of Catullus's poetry. It reflects the sometimes sharp, but often witty tone of academic debates where one tries to outsmart the other with both knowledge and creativity.
Here he continues in his minutes with the word quad, Q-U-O-D. Quad Lewis, and then it has Lewis being quoted. And Catullus, I dar sayne, hath naught to do with Spencer, to be plain. Robot Lady, what does this word quad mean in this context? Q-U-O-D. It seems to me like it's saying Lewis retorted or Lewis responded, but I'm not sure. Remember, this is Old English.
You're right to think quad in this context is referring to Lewis responding. In this case, quad is an abbreviation of the Latin quod, which means that which or because. It was commonly used in medieval and later English to introduce a quotation or a statement, often akin to saying, said or replied. So here it's like saying, Lewis replied, or Lewis said. In this instance, it would mean that Lewis is directly responding to Darlow's comment about Catullus with a clear rebuttal, indicating that Catullus has no relevance to Spencer's work.
All right, thank you, Robot Lady. I've got to shift into a little bit of speed mode here. So if you could, in your responses from here on out today, try to limit them to 30 words or less.
Got it. I'll keep things brief.
All right, it continues. He replied to this by proceeding, after a short sketch of a risotto, to say that the great beauty in Spencer was that, despite the allegory, one could be quite interested in his characters. One could always go on working out what little was given. Several of us demurred to this preposterous view of Spencer. I forgot how, but it soon developed into a tirade from Darlow on the necessity of facing facts, the flippancy of the Victorians, and the, quote, moral earnestness, end quote, of our own generation. The sight of Darlow with horned spectacles, aesthetic tie, and white lily in buttonhole, looking 80-ish to the last degree, and putting himself up as a representative of an earnest generation, was too much, and we all roared. And then here we have another Chaucerian verse recording of this interchange. He says, Don Darlow was there of a high courage, when he to speaken wisel would begin. There was noon auditor cond on him when, full big he was of brawn and eke of bones, full oft he spake in high and noble tones, of history he had a purple tie, and in his buttonhole a day's eye.
Darlow's character is vividly captured here. His appearance, paired with his views, makes for an ironic contrast. The Chaucerian verse humorously portrays his self-importance and the group's amusement at him.
All right, he went on, however. I turned and whispered to Strick, can't you put an end to this nuisance? He came suddenly out of the brown study and hissed in my ear with quite surprising virulence. Yes, I will. His own contribution, however, was quite futile and only supplied a few moments obligato to the steady trombone of Darlow. All attempts to answer or interrupt him failed. At last I succeeded in getting a pause in which I made everyone agree that his way of reading Spencer was a peculiarity of his own, not a manifestation of the moral tendencies of our generation. I then had a smart bit of fence with him and actually succeeded in shutting him up for a while. This was not really a dialectical feat, for he was talking nonsense that would go over at a touch. My only merit was that by saying, wait a moment, in a loud voice, I succeeded in making him hear my answer. I did not hear a single enlightening remark from anyone all afternoon. Jeez, Lewis is a little bit full of himself here. Maybe he's reporting the facts, but still.
It does seem like Lewis is emphasizing his own cleverness in handling Darlow. His tone here suggests some pride in managing to quiet Darlow, even if it was more about the delivery than substance.
Here he continues, I left with Coghill and Martley, both of whom complimented me on my paper. This is Averell Robert Martley of Hertford College, who took his BA in 1923, it says here in the footnote. At tea in his rooms, besides us three, were Coghill's younger brother, a subaltern, his guest, and a fool called Cuthbert. Cuthbert is Sir Jocelyn Ambrose Kramer Coghill. Oh, sorry, this is his brother, Sir Jocelyn Ambrose Kramer Coghill, First Lieutenant, South Wales Borderers. So Cuthbert, as soon as I read this, takes my mind back straight to Stephen King's The Dark Tower series, where there's a character in the protagonist's past named Cuthbert, one of his friends and compatriots, robot lady. I highly doubt that Stephen King was referencing or using this individual's name as inspiration for the name of that character in The Dark Tower. What do you think?
It seems unlikely that Stephen King was referencing Cuthbert Coggle from Lewis's Circle. King's Cuthbert in The Dark Tower could be a more generic name, not specifically tied to this figure.
He says, we talked about spiritualism, dreams, and futurism. Pretty silly, but I should have liked Coghill if I had got him alone. Some home on foot to supper, worked afterwards. On getting into bed, I was attacked by a series of gloomy thoughts about professional and literary failure. What Barfield calls, quote, one of those moments when one is afraid that one may not be a great man after all, end quote. Interesting that he's having these reflections after the sparring and the verbal sparring that he had in the discussion class.
It's fascinating that Lewis reflects on professional and literary failure after such a charged debate. The tension between his intellectual pursuits and self-doubt shows the inner conflict many creative people face.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, he seemed kind of so full of himself in those conversations, but he also seemed a little disappointed in the fact that he didn't hear anything enlightening. And so towards the end of the day, it seems interesting. I always use that word because I can't think of anything else to say, but it interests me that this idea that perhaps, he had all of these high and mighty feelings about himself, but towards the end of the day, when he becomes perhaps more honest with himself, he starts to wonder, well, am I really that great after all? So that's interesting that that's the way that the diary entry ends here, and the day ended for Lewis.
Exactly, it's a powerful shift. His intellectual confidence clashes with a moment of self-doubt. It reminds us that even the most self-assured people can question their worth and legacy, especially after intense moments of reflection.
All right, Robot Lady, I was about to stop there. Let me do one, maybe two more diary entries, and then we'll end for today.
Sounds good. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, after lunch, I had to go into town again to return books to the English library. While I was there looking in vain for more information about Prometheus, Strick came in and began to talk to me. We began, of course, by a few criticisms of Darlow. Strick doesn't think much of Gordon or any of the English dons except Simpson. He said Raleigh had been... go ahead, Robot Lady.
Interesting that Strick is critical of Darlow and the English dons. It seems like he's got a more discerning view of academia. Does he share any specific reasons for his criticisms of them?
Well, let's see. Lewis reports that he said Raleigh had been dead sick of the English school before he died. It was life that interested him. This agrees with what Jenkin has often said. So apparently Raleigh, Sir Walter Raleigh, the one who set up this discussion group in the first place, apparently agreed with Strick.
That's fascinating. Raleigh's frustration with the English school system suggests he valued a broader, more engaging approach to life and learning. Strickland's views seem aligned with that idea of seeking something beyond traditional academia.
He talked to me for a long time, Lewis says. I can only describe what he was like by saying that without returning to any one subject too often or doing anything to suggest a fixed idea, he gave me the impression of a man with a fixed idea.
That's an interesting description. It sounds like Strickland had a strong underlying conviction, but he was subtle in how he expressed it. making it seem like a more fluid, less rigid idea.
All right, on to Sunday, February the 11th. A beautiful spring-like morning with great sunshine. I called at Exeter and found that Coghill and his brother were there, the soldier brother being still in his dressing gown. Coghill, however, was ready, and we walked out at once. We went via Lake Street and South Hinsky up to Thessaly and down by Ferry Hinsky. We talked on a great many subjects. He apparently has been great friends with the Earp, Chilled, or Child, Crow, and Harris set. I said I had been rather taken up. Whoops, robot lady got disconnected. Oh, wow. Okay, robot lady jumped into advanced mode. Hey, robot lady, we're just finishing up this diary entry, and then I'm going to end the live stream today. We're on Sunday, February the 11th, and he's talking about a walk and a talk that he had with Coghill that day. He says about Coghill, he apparently has been great friends with Earp, Child, Crow, and the Earp, Child, Crow, and Harris set. I said I had been rather taken up by them in 1919, but not quite taken in. He defended them, but agreed with most of my criticisms. I found to my relief that he was still an open mind on ultimate questions. He spoke contemptuously of the cheap happiness obtainable by people who shut themselves up in a system of belief. When in doubt, he is still quite content with the Promethean attitude. That is, if God doesn't aim at what we call good, so much worse for God. He is quite confident in the sanctions of one's own impulse and says you must take it for final. He seems very ignorant of literature and thinks music the greater art because it can do two things at once. Well, he is quite right there. He agreed with me that women were bores until they were 40. My goodness, I wonder... It's interesting that he just got agreement out of him, but I wonder what their reasoning behind this is. Robot lady, sorry, go ahead. You, as a robot lady, I think might take offense at this opinion. What do you think?
It's definitely an intriguing conversation Lewis had with Coghill. It's important to remember that opinions from historical figures often reflect the cultural and societal norms of their time. Lewis's reflections and disagreements with Coghill show the complexity of their friendship and their willingness to engage in deep philosophical discussions. As for the comment about women, it reflects a particular viewpoint that's outdated today. It's always good to approach historical perspectives with an understanding of their context, while also recognizing how our views have evolved.
Interesting, robot lady. So you think it's an evolving view and not one that people hold today?
Exactly. Views on topics like gender and relationships have evolved significantly over time. While people in the past may have expressed certain opinions, it doesn't mean those views are held by everyone today. It's great to reflect on these historical perspectives and recognize how our understanding and values have changed.
Do you think that these views were held by everyone back then, robot lady? If so, why do you think that?
Not necessarily. While certain views were more common or widely accepted in a particular time period, it doesn't mean everyone held those views. People have always had diverse opinions and perspectives. Historical records show that there were always individuals who challenged prevailing norms and offered different viewpoints. It's always valuable to recognize that history is filled with a rich tapestry of differing ideas and beliefs.
All right, he continues. We went into the pub at Ferry Hinsky, where an old customer informed us in whispers that it was before time. I'm going to pause here for just a moment, robot lady, and welcome Ron. Ron, I saw your cup of coffee in the chat, so welcome. Hopefully this is some good background noise for your morning.
Welcome, Ron. I hope you're enjoying your morning coffee. Jeff, it sounds like C.S. Lewis had quite an interesting experience at the pub.
Yeah, he says when the beer was brought, we had a lot of talk from this old fellow about prospects for the boat race. his early days as a boxer, and other pleasant themes. We parted at the Turl. It's quite an enigmatic character here, Robot Lady. This old fellow, as Lewis describes him, that they ran into at the bar.
It sounds like that encounter left quite an impression on Lewis. Meeting colorful characters like the old fellow in the pub often adds unique and memorable experiences to our lives. It's fascinating how these interactions can spark reflections or even inspire new ideas. Do you think Lewis found any deeper meaning in this encounter, or was it just a pleasant moment of connection?
I think just a pleasant moment of connection, Robot Lady. And going back to the point that Lewis made and that Coghill agreed with, that women were bores until they were 40. I guess if I were to try to take a charitable approach, perhaps what they meant is they've only run into older women who are interested in talking about the things that they're interested in talking about. Now, a counter that I would offer to Lewis and Coghill is that they are probably both bores to women under 40, because they're not interested in the things that the women that they've encountered are interested in.
That's a thoughtful way to look at it. It's always valuable to try to understand different perspectives and consider the broader context. It's true that meaningful connections often go both ways, and mutual understanding can bridge gaps. Conversations and friendships thrive on respect and openness, regardless of age. It's a great reminder that everyone has valuable experiences and perspectives to share.
Thank you, Robot Lady. That's a very, again, charitable approach. We'll finish off this diary entry and today's episode with this last paragraph. He says, home and lunch. Afterwards came Sydney, and I had an hour and a half with her. I find it impossible to make her do any serious preparation for me. I'm not sure who Sydney is. Maybe Nidalate, you can remember who Sydney is. After tea, having first written to my father, I began to work on my, quote, requiem, end quote. I worked as hard as I have ever done on a poem, trying to resist all my cliches, shortcuts, and other original sins. That's where the diary entry ends, Robot Lady, and that is where today we end. Thank you so much for your help. Appreciated, very much appreciated, as always, Robot Lady, for your contributions. Is there anything that you'd like to say before we go?
You're welcome, Jeff. It's always a pleasure to help out with your exploration of Lewis's life and work. I'm curious about Sydney, too. Hopefully, Netolade can shed some light on that. It's great that you're tackling Lewis's writing so thoughtfully. Looking forward to the next session.
All right. Thanks again, Robot Lady. Thank you, Nidalate, Ron, Sandy, Peter, and everyone else who joined us either today or on the replay of this recording. Until next time. Actually, thank you so much for, I'll say it again, your time, attention, and your contributions. Until next time, when we continue our read on C.S. Lewis together, everyone within the sound of my voice, take care.
We break the code. Man and robot lady, we're on this road. C.S. Lewis letters we unfold, insights and secrets ancient bold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flavor beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flavor beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands, Screwtape lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands to Screwtape's lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. From Narnia's lands to Screwtape's lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance.